President Reagan is in Normandy and speaking now.
Because it's the most deeply honorable form of government ever devised by man. All of you loved liberty. All of you were willing to fight tyranny. And you knew the people of your countries were behind you. The Americans who fought here that morning knew word of the invasion was spreading through the darkness back home. They fought or felt in their hearts, though they couldn't know in fact, that in Georgia, they were filling the churches at 4 a.m. In Kansas, they were kneeling on their porches and praying. And in Philadelphia, they were ringing the Liberty Bell. Something else helped the men of D-Day. Their rock-hard belief that Providence would have a great hand in the events that would unfold here, that God was an ally in this great cause. And so, the night before the invasion, when Colonel Wolverton asked his parachute troops to kneel with him in prayer, he told them, "Do not bow your heads, but look up so you can see God and ask his blessing in what we are about to do." Also that night, General Matthew Ridgway on his cot, listening in the darkness for the promise God made to Joshua, "I will not fail thee nor forsake thee." These are the things that impelled him. These are the things that shaped the unity of the Allies. When the war was over, there were lives to be rebuilt and governments to be returned to the people. There were nations to be reborn. Above all, there was a new peace to be assured. These were huge and daunting tasks, but the Allies summoned strength from the faith, belief, loyalty, and love of those who fell here. They rebuilt a new Europe together. There was first a great reconciliation among those who had been enemies, all of whom had suffered so greatly. The United States did its part, creating the Marshall Plan to help rebuild our allies and our former enemies. The Marshall Plan led to the Atlantic Alliance, a great alliance that serves to this day as our shield for freedom, for prosperity, and for peace. In spite of our great efforts and successes, not all that followed the end of the war was happy or planned. Some liberated countries were lost. The great sadness of this loss echoes down to our own time in the streets of Warsaw, Prague, and East Berlin. The Soviet troops that came to the center of this continent did not leave when peace came. They're still there, uninvited, unwanted, unyielding, almost 40 years after the war. Because of this, Allied forces still stand on this continent. Today, as 40 years ago, our armies are here for only one purpose: to protect and defend democracy. The only territories we hold are memorials like this one and graveyards where our heroes rest. We in America have learned bitter lessons from 2 world wars. It is better to be here ready to protect the peace than to take blind shelter across the sea, rushing to respond only after freedom is lost. We've learned that isolationism never was and never will be an acceptable response to tyrannical governments with an expansionist intent. But we try always to be prepared for peace, prepared to deter aggression, prepared to negotiate the reduction of arms, and yes, prepared to reach out again in the spirit of reconciliation. In truth, there is no reconciliation we would welcome more than a Soviet Union, so together we can lessen the risks of war now and forever. It's fitting to remember here the great losses also suffered by the Russian people during World War II. 20 million perished, a terrible price that testifies to all the world the necessity of ending war. I tell you from my heart that we in the United States do not want war. We want to wipe from the face of the earth the terrible weapons that man now has in his hands. And I tell you, we're ready to seize that beachhead. We look for some sign from the Soviet Union that they are willing to move forward, that they share our desire and love for peace, and that they will give up the ways of conquest. There must be a changing there that will allow us to turn our hope into action. We will pray forever that someday that changing will come. But for now, particularly today, it is good and fitting to renew our commitment to each other, to our freedom, and to the alliance that protects it. We're bound today by what bound us 40 years ago, the same loyalties, traditions, and beliefs. We're bound by reality. The strength of America's allies is vital to the United States, and the American security guarantee is essential to the continued freedom of Europe's democracies. We were with you then, we're with you now. Your hopes are our hopes, and your destiny is our destiny. Here in this place, where the West held together, let us make a vow to our dead. Let us show them by our actions that we understand what they died for. Let our actions say to them the words for which Matthew Ridgway listened: I will not fail thee nor forsake thee. Strengthened by their courage, heartened by their value, and borne by their memory, let us continue to stand for the ideals for which they lived and died. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
President Reagan in Normandy this afternoon, a speech which is thought to have been the most important of the ones that he will make in his visit to Europe, with 2 points that we have just heard. First, his further pledge to remain in the continent of Europe and to reject isolationism in the United States. Secondly, his remarks about the Soviet Union and the sacrifices made by the Soviet people in the course of the last war. The Soviet Union has spent some time belittling the D-Day landings in the course of the past 2 or 3 weeks. President Reagan was encouraged to say something friendly about what the Soviet people did during that war, and he duly did it this afternoon. He's at Pointe du Hoc, the place where the American 2nd Ranger Battalion scaled the cliffs in order to knock out what was believed to be a German battery that could, in fact, have attacked both the Omaha beach and the Utah beach. And there is the memorial to the Rangers. Now, the Allies knew in 1944 that they could deal with the German Navy and the German Air Force. They were worried about the big coast defense batteries
Ladies
covering
and
the
gentlemen,
landing
will
beaches.
you please rise
The RAF
for a
bombed them,
moment of
the Navy
silence?
shelled them, but at Pointe du Hoc, assurance had to be made doubly sure.
Lying between the 2 American beaches of Utah and Omaha, Pointe du Hoc juts aggressively into the sea. It looks as forbidding in summer peacetime as it did 40 years ago, when it was used as a site for a German battery. Then, as now, a solid concrete observation bunker sits on the very tip of the point. From here, artillery officers could control the fire of the guns behind them. These 150mm guns had a range of 23,500 meters, so both American landing beaches were within range. In specially sighted gun emplacements, they were also a threat to any ships approaching the coast, and as mobile coast artillery, they could also be moved to alternative firing positions. The whole headland was pockmarked with enormous craters. Unknown to the Allies and the Rangers, one gun had already been destroyed and all the others had been moved.
We were supposed to land 5 minutes after the bombing and the shelling ceased. So we were half hour late, so the Germans were there waiting for us, and all hell broke loose.
They were being bombed silly with thousands and thousands of bombs from aerial bombardment and ships at sea. So they moved their guns in anticipation, days, maybe weeks before D-Day, into an alternate position. And incidentally, there were no shell craters or bomb craters around their alternate position, so you see they had to wisely move them.
Omaha Beach, too, had been threatened by these big guns, and, in the desperate state in which the Americans were on that day, fire from Pointe du Hoc might well have tipped the balance against them. Their own Rangers' fierce assault on that cliff top, at great cost, had removed that threat to the landing beaches.
Now, before the Allies landed, the French resistance had built up its attacks on the Germans and had waited long months to hear the code words that the landings were beginning. It wasn't just the RAF, but the resistance that knocked out the railway lines and the routes that meant the Germans would be slow to get reinforcements through to the Normandy beaches. just 40 years ago.
When the Allies landed on the Normandy beaches, they knew where virtually every German gun battery was positioned, largely due to the work of the French resistance. They knew what caliber the guns were, and even how many troops manned them, and how thick their concrete protection was. The resistance built up vital maps for the Allies by recruiting agents who lived inside the restricted coastal areas of northern France. As the beach defenses expanded, local doctors, farmers, builders memorized details on their daily rounds, pacing out distances between gun batteries and ferreting out information from building contractors. Perhaps the biggest coup by the resistance was pulled off by René Douchet, a painter and decorator from Caen. His widow Odette remembers how he did it.
C'est un petit peu par hasard, en passant devant la mairie de...
It was rather by chance. The German engineers building the wall advertised for someone to decorate two of their offices in their Caen headquarters in the Rue de Jules. My husband went along and made a very cheap estimate so he could win the contract and take a snoop round. Whilst he was in the office of the Gauerleiter, he saw a pile of maps on his desk marked top secret. When the officer had his back turned to speak to his secretary, my husband, completely on impulse, took one of the maps and stuffed it behind a large mirror which was hung, leaning out slightly from the wall. My husband went back later to do the decorating and to pick up the map, but the Gauerleiter had been relieved of his post because they'd found the map was missing. My husband had some difficulty getting into the office, but eventually managed to smuggle the map out in a roll of wallpaper. Funnily enough, the Germans never suspected him because the Gauerleiter had been with him in the room the whole time.
René Douchet delivered the map through the resistance network to the head of the Century Group, Colonel Remy. But the map only just made it across the channel. Remy came under Gestapo suspicion and had to flee with his wife and 4 children. Madame Remy vividly remembers the terrifying journey on the tiny Normandy fishing trawler.
We arrived in the trawler at the German checkpoint at 5 o'clock. I can show you on this model. I hid in the left-hand back locker with one child. The 2 others were in the right, and my husband and 16-month-old baby were under the forward hatch along with the Douchet map. The Germans came alongside. They were checking every other boat that left the port that morning. We heard their steps up and down the deck, but they never checked the hold, and all of a sudden the motor started up and we were away. It was a miracle.
The crucial map, tied up with bundles of other intelligence reports, escaped in the trawler with the Remy family to London. No one in the French resistance knew at that time how important the map was, but Colonel Remy believes it convinced the Allies that Normandy was the best landing place. After the war, the colonel, now a frail 80 years old, was thanked by the American General Omar Bradley, who said,
"Thanks to a map that was brought to England in June 1942, that the point of landing was chosen. The details were so perfect from Cherbourg to the Seine. Guns, pillboxes, blockhouse, and so on. The informations were so precise that we lost the minimum of men and material."
Before D-Day, we were given 5 messages that were to be heard. The first one within a week before D-Day, and the others later to give the order for sabotage. Radios were banned. The Germans had requisitioned all the radios. And myself, with the help of a friend, I built a crystal set, and the crystal was there, and I kept this part hidden in a tin, and I kept the tin in the cellar with dry beans on the top, and I kept the earphones in the attic in an old trunk with old things, and it was only 2 or 3 times a day that I would connect the two, and then we knew the time at first thanks to some leaflets that were dropped. L'Angleterre vous parle. England is speaking to you.
the Normandy Maquis group of St. Clair were told to attack military convoys and, at the station of Grambozo, to blow up the strategic railway line which could be used to bring up German reinforcements from Le Mans. 5 members of the group cycled across country for over 7 hours on the night of D-Day after they received their secret BBC message, "The dice are on the carpet." André Hérissi was the group's explosives expert.
What I had to do was find the joints in the line in the dark and place the plastic explosives underneath at 4 places like that. When it went off, woof, 8 rails were destroyed. I put a bit too much in that night, and the explosion was so enormous that a good 2 minutes afterwards there were stones raining down on us. It was a bit dodgy.
The Allies had to muster 3 million troops for the landing 40 years ago. They did. Control the sea and the air. They did. And deceive the Germans about just where the landing would be. They did that.
The object which I produced for the Field Marshal to agree, so far as I can remember, was simply this: to make the enemy reinforce the Pas-de-Calais area at the expense of the invasion area, and to retain the enemy forces in that area of Pas-de-Calais for as long as possible after D-Day. We achieved our object. I couldn't believe how long the enemy was stupid enough to stay sitting in the Pas-de-Calais.
Well, at the Pointe du Hoc, it does seem that President Reagan is talking to Walter Cronkite. Walter Cronkite, in fact, went back to the beaches with President Eisenhower when he was president. But let's see if we can overhear what they're saying.
Really?
Well, we can't quite hear what they're saying. Not everything goes right on D-Day, even after 40 years. Going back 40 years, the landing needed over 6,000 ships, 138 to bombard, 221 to convoy, 287 to sweep mines, 495 light craft to buzz about, 58 to hunt U-boats, and 4,000 to land the troops. It was the biggest invasion fleet ever, with the biggest firepower.
The ship that fired the opening shots on that day 40 years ago is still afloat. The heavy cruiser HMS Belfast, now a museum moored near Tower Bridge in London. As her 6-inch guns began bellowing broadsides at 5:30 that morning, they signalled the start of the heaviest naval bombardment in history.
I shall never forget it. The troops in the big transports were lining the decks. They just cheered madly. And the cheers rolled from ship to ship. From Stokes Bay to Ryde, you could hear it.
In the weather as it was, which was still rough, sticking up an 18-foot telescopic mast and the various other gadgets, but one had a quick look to seaward, and one saw the invasion force just as the Germans would, and it was terribly frightening. Although we knew they were on our side, it was still very frightening, and I can imagine the Germans' feelings.
And on Sword Beach, between the seaside towns of Lyon-sur-Mer and Ouistreham, the British 3rd Division landed. Both the South Lancs and the East Yorks had severe casualties from the German fortified position at La Brèche. But La Brèche was captured after 3 hours of fighting.
They've not changed a lot, these beaches. They're now quiet reminders of the skill, courage and sacrifice required to take them. Sword Beach, at the extreme eastern end of the whole invasion area, was dreadfully exposed on its flank because of the estuary of the Orne River. Across the river was the 21st Panzer Division. The objectives here on D-Day were to link up with the airborne forces at Pegasus Bridge, to link up with Juno Beach next door, and to capture Caen. At the end of the day, the advance on Caen had moved only a few miles. The link with Juno was not made, but the vital relief at Pegasus Bridge had been accomplished.
And I don't know what was you, the brigade major said, well, Millen, how about a tune? Well, now I can tell you this, it seemed rather crazy to me at the time. All hell was
I've got to
being
correct
loose.
you. We weren't standing by the water. It was much too dangerous. It was in the sand dunes. We cleared the water's edge. I was
anyway,
scared of that.
I asked if I would play this tune. I play a tune. I said, what tune would you like, sir? You said, The Road to the Isles. Oh, I said, sounded crazy. And do you want me to walk up and down, sir? Yes, just march up and down, Papa.
Well, the shells are dropping in the water, and well, I don't think you can imagine a whiplash, a shock wave coming through the water. As soon as I hit the beach, I wanted to go. I wanted to move. I wanted to go, get away from that water. And I don't know, I think I went across that beach like a hare.
An immediate objective was to take the lock bridges at Weestrom, but there were only a few close combat Churchill tanks available.
I could see that they'd been prepared for demolition because you could see the explosive charges and these cables that ran down the sides of the road. So we drove across the bridge fairly fast, the near bridge, cutting the detonating cord as we crossed with our tracks. And I was about to collect together all our brain gun teams for infantry-style attack across, when a white flag went up and out they came and surrendered.
We were halfway hoisted and my Sergeant Major, Colour Sergeant Francis, he was so delighted and he was so thrilled that I'd got them ashore and got back. He climbed over and he jumped on the landing craft because I was still stuck below. I couldn't move, I was frozen. And he hauled me up and tears streaming down his eyes and he helped me over the whale. Got me over the whale. Well done, Corp, you know.
The Germans were still there. They must have been like us, felt exactly the same as we did. Absolutely shit scared. I'm sorry about that word, but I am a soldier. They must have been, and so were we. So we knew that when we landed, we had to get in. We had to take that beach. And if we'd have been driven back into the sea, it would have been the end of our beach, but it wasn't.
Gold Beach at the western end of the British sector provided perhaps the most successful assault, carried out by the men of the 50th Infantry Division. The problems here were again the fortified villages at the shore's edge and the soft sand making things difficult for the armour. But there was an additional hazard. The Germans had one of their most powerful artillery batteries at Long, and both the Navy and the RAF had failed to take it out. The objectives here were to capture Bayeux and link up with Juno Beach and the Americans at Omaha. At the end of the day, they were in the suburbs of Bayeux, but there was no link with the Americans.
There was only one thing to do, and that was to get the soldiers away from those tanks. Now, that we did. As luck would have it, there was a lone tree over on the flank of the Germans. And I got my company over to the lone tree, not a German looking in our direction. So we wandered up from the flank and took the position with no problem at all.
As I was going along the road, my first casualty was there was a German 88 millimeters firing from up on the Mavane Ridge down at us. And we just sort of pedalled on because our job was not to stop, but to get through somehow or other. And I looked round and found that this thing had fired solid shot at the chap behind me. And I found a chap pedaling a bicycle without a head on, which was rather worrying, crashed into the ditch. And that was my first casualty I saw. I had a sick feeling about it, but the obvious thing to do was to get on as fast as we could.
For the operating table, we couldn't take an operating table in. Just we had a stretcher on, I think we were on boxes or whatever we could find. It was very, very crude, but it was, if you were going to save those people's lives, it was, you know, the thing to do, was to operate on them as soon as you could.
Ray Maloney, as we've seen earlier, has been spending the day with a coachload of ex-servicemen and war widows who've been flown to Normandy for the anniversary. Here's his latest report.
The bus carrying the D-Day veterans fell almost totally silent as the first headstones of the Commonwealth Cemetery here in Bayeux came into view. This is the largest single Second World War cemetery in France, with more than 4,600 graves and the names of a further 1,800 men whose bodies have never been found. But this was not only a day for the veterans. The D-Day widows, after a long argument with the Ministry of Defence, were also here, and some had mixed feelings about the occasion.
I'm over the moon, I'm very, very happy. But also I wonder why we've had to wait all this long time to come, when there's been all the years in between. Or because we won't be able to come anymore anyway, because we're too old to come now.
Let's hope they'll be a little more sympathetic to us now. We've had a hard time, you know, bringing up our children. And it's the children I feel sorry for. They never knew their fathers. It's terrible. No money.
This afternoon, Her Majesty the Queen joins the veterans and the widows here for a solemn ceremony of remembrance and to lay a wreath alongside those from the people for whom June the 6th, 1944, is a memory of pride, tragedy, or sadness. Some brought and showed with pride the last letter, the last pictures.
Yes, I was with the 6 Green Howards. I landed H+70. And there are over 40 of my men in this cemetery. And there are another 60 odd in Jerusalem Crossroads and Hutter. And many of them by me. It's not a time for words, is it?
Across the memorial gateway to the cemetery is a Latin inscription. It reads, "We, once conquered by William, have now set free the conqueror's native land."
President Reagan's helicopter is now just hovering above Omaha Beach, where the Americans had such a hard time 40 years ago at the Colville Cemetery, which he'll be visiting shortly. Earlier this afternoon, his first stop was at the Pointe du Hoc. That was where the American 2nd Ranger Battalion came ashore and scaled the heights in order to knock out what was thought to be a German battery there, which would have dominated the beaches to both the east and the west. We heard his speech earlier in this program, and then he unveiled a small memorial to the Rangers who died there. A French and an American occasion. The French who helped America to their independence, recognizing how America had helped to liberate Europe. Mr. and Mrs. Reagan went into the German command point in the battery and saw what the Germans would have seen on that morning 40 years ago. What the Germans did not see was the Americans scaling the cliffs by rope ladders. What the Germans did feel was the fire of 2 destroyers, 1 American and 1 British, which reached them and began the devastation which ended with the Rangers taking the battery. And the President and Mrs. Reagan then went down the line of those American veterans who had come again today, and he heard their story, and they shook his hand. And at Colville Cemetery, above Omaha Beach, the President's helicopter is just about to land. Now, this is a moment the Americans have collected so many of their graves together at Colville. There are more than 10,000 who lie there. The Christians with a cross, the Jews with the Star of David above. And the President will be there and landing with Mrs. Reagan in just a moment. Omaha was not a happy landing for the Americans. A little further west, because the tide breaks on Normandy's beaches at different times from west to east, the Americans in the far west went ashore first, an hour before the British. At Utah Beach, they actually began badly. They met an unswept minefield, and the current took the underpowered landing craft too far to the south. That was their luckiest moment.
The wide, windswept Utah Beach lay on the extreme western edge of all the invasion beaches. Here, the very first of the 3 million invasion troops landed. There are now few reminders of that great feat of arms, nor of the horror and awfulness of that long, long walk through the waves, across the sand strewn with deadly beach obstacles, into the mouths of the German guns.
La nuit, c'était quelque chose d'infernal, infernal, infernal. On croyait devenir sourd par l'importance des bombardements. Et puis les avions, c'était quelque chose de terrible. Nous ne pouvions pas rester dans la maison. Il n'y avait plus de toiture, plus de fenêtres, plus de portes. Et tout d'un coup, nous avons été obligés de partir dans une tranchée. Et on voyait les avions qui lâchaient les bombes. On ne pouvait plus respirer par cette odeur de poudre.
Well, it was just like a show. We went in, we were looking at the planes bombing, and just like it was a Hollywood show. They saw the bombs falling, this and that. They dropped the ramp, and as we went in, the bombs just ceased, and it was just like a big play. But until they start shooting, you know, and a few shells came, then you realized that it wasn't a play, but going in was beautiful.
On the spot they were due to land were very strong German defenses, guarding the 2 best exit points from the beach. But errors had brought the troops onto the beach at La Madeleine, 2,000 yards to the south. It was along this stretch that the Americans, to their surprise, met the first French people, among them Madame Lotte and her rather worried father.
Et mon père a dit, taisez-vous, taisez-vous, j'entends parler, écoutez, écoutez. Tout d'un coup, il a dit, mais j'entends parler anglais. Vite, il est sorti, et c'était un Américain qui était ici avec le fusil. Alors mon père a levé les bras, il dit, hey, Frenchman, Frenchman. Il dit, ah, parce que lui, je ne suis pas allemand. Alors...
In the evening, I kept thinking, well, we're in this field now, I wonder where the Germans are. We had them surrounded, but maybe they had us surrounded. And my thought was, gee, I hope it gets to be daylight again. And that's, I think, we all felt that way. I think we prayed for daylight and we prayed for nighttime. And when nighttime came, we thought, gee, I wish it were daylight so we could get out of here and move somewhere else. I mean it, we all felt that way.
By the end of the day, the beach was clear and ready to receive more reinforcements. Although the relief column to beleaguered paratroopers at Saint-Mary-Glise had still to get through, the four causeways were secure and the big guns silenced. The area held was smaller than planned, but stronger and better organized than might have been expected. The Americans were ashore. From the sand dunes by the beach at La Madeleine, the names of those who died are remembered, marking the roads where they fell as they moved inland to fight on in the rich farmlands of Normandy, to head towards the port of Cherbourg in the north, and to link up with their compatriots, fighting fiercely as they landed on the beach at Omaha. 10,000 Americans who died in the Normandy campaign lie here. 1 in every 10 of these graves in this vast cemetery on the bluff above Omaha Beach holds the body of a man who died here on invasion day itself. Men of the 1st Infantry Division who stormed ashore in a gallant, if somewhat reckless, frontal assault. For behind the beach was a steep bluff from which the Germans could dominate the beach below with devastating crossfire.
Now you think of it, it's rather awesome when I look down here from the Germans' view of us. I don't know. I don't think I'd want to do it again.
As the 88s were coming in, I dropped on the beach, and there was dead bodies as well as live soldiers. And as I was ready to get up and move again, the man next to me, I nudged him and says, "Let's go." And he didn't move. I hit him again with my elbow, and then I looked over and I saw the poor fellow had a large hole in the side of his head.
When we finally cut through the barbed wire and everything like that, a shell hit close that the brush went on fire, and they told us to use a gas mask, which was no good. It just pulled all that smoke into our faces, the ones that put it on. And then I didn't put it, and when I saw these guys suffering, coughing and everything, I figured, gee, what are they using on us now?
You had to go single file, and there was about 4 men laying there with their foot blown off from mines, and you could not walk on either. You had to just step over them, of course. There was mines on each side of you. They would more or less go up there, go as far as they could. They'd step on a mine, and another guy would take over and marking them, and if he stepped on one and another one. There was 3 or 4 of them laying there.
The big German guns had pinned down the American advance, so they moved forward only 1.5 miles in the Colville area, and even less than that west of Saint-Laurent. It was more of a toehold than even a foothold, and they were a long way from the planned beachhead boundary. Beyond the Americans' forward positions, enemy cut-off groups were still fighting hard. Behind them, the beach was under intermittent fire. Conditions were far from good, and there would be further delays in landing the follow-up troops. The terrible events which took place on these sands are seared into the memories of those who fought here. But there are other memories, too.
We're here today, you know, to not to tell about what we did, but out of respect for those that stayed here on the beach. And it's been a very moving experience. When we were in the chapel today and had services, it was a very deeply moving thing. You could feel the gratefulness of a small village.
The church is in the tiny hamlet of Colville, only 1 mile up one of the steep wooded exit draws from the beach. Here, the villagers also remember in their own way.
As of today, from now on, it will be the avenue of the 1st Infantry Division.
So the Americans come back, year after year, to remember both their deeds and their dead. For each of them, a personal pilgrimage to remember those who died as individuals, and to remember that the highest casualties had come from those who were first ashore, and also how that initial assault had gained them the momentum to carry the Allies into Normandy and on into the heart of fortress Europe.
The Queen has just left Caen. She landed there, in fact, earlier this morning, as we saw, and she disembarked from the Royal Yacht Britannia, where she was having a lunch for all the dignitaries and worthies of the town, and making her way by road to Bayeux, the Duke of Edinburgh with her. She may well remember what her days during the invasion were. She, in fact, was trying to get called up. She was trying to persuade her father, King George VI, that she should be called up. And indeed, eventually she was, and became a junior transport officer in the ATS. And the Duke of Edinburgh with her, well, of course, he was with the Navy, and in fact, he served in the battleship Valiant at the Battle of Cape Matapan. At Bayeux, President Mitterrand lays the wreath in remembrance of those who died. In the British cemetery, it says, "Their name liveth forevermore." And in all the Commonwealth cemeteries, there is no segregation. Those of Britain, those of our allies, the graves of the Germans are also there together. President Mitterrand will, later this year, be going to Verdun, to the great cemetery of the First World War, where he will be with Chancellor Kohl of West Germany. There are no German representatives in Normandy this week. Normandy is the Duchy of France, which had the temerity in 1066 to conquer England. In fact, the invasion fleet of William the Conqueror left just from the coast a little bit to the east of here from the Dives River. In 1944, the British, with the Americans whom the French had brought to nationhood, returned, and the Canadians. And so many of the regiments which came to Normandy in the Canadian army were French-Canadian, and they lie too just across the road, within sight of the beaches they liberated. And President Mitterrand moves away from the Marseillaise and from the moment before the wreath laid at the memorial. He, of course, with the Queen, will also be going, like President Reagan, to Utah Beach, where the three heads of state will meet, the three allies who joined arms on that day. And also in the course of the afternoon, the Queen will be going to the Canadian cemetery at Bagny-sur-Mer, where M. Trudeau will be there to meet her too. In the history of France, Liberation Day is one in which there are two sides. Many of those who landed in Normandy on that day felt that some of those who were there had been happy that the war had been going on without them being attacked from the air or by naval shells. And it was thought that some of the French, particularly those who had supported Marshal Pétain in Vichy during the war, would be resentful. Churchill himself was extremely afraid that the Allied air attacks against French towns and bridges would cause resentment. But when the landings came, and when the troops pushed ashore, there was no doubt about their welcome. And even in Caen itself, the city which had been so devastated by Allied bombs, the city which was on fire for 11 days, the welcome was still warm. The Royal Navy, drawn up outside the British cemetery at Bayeux. Bayeux was taken D-Day +1 and saw very little fighting. It was the first success that the Allies had inland from the beaches, and it was also the first town that General de Gaulle himself visited. As Ray Maloney was saying opposite the cemetery, it does say how those who had been conquered by William the Conqueror came back to liberate Normandy. Inside the cemetery, there lie 3,900 graves of British troops. And walking down beside them, because they are enormously well tended with plants and flowers of the season, the grass mown, all that one can see is how young they were, 18, 19, 20. And so the French wait, and we all wait, for the Queen to come. We'll be reporting on this later in the afternoon, and of course at 7 o'clock tonight we'll have a very full roundup of all the events. Now, it's D for Derby Day.